Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Edmonds. I'm not a lawyer. First thing for everybody to know. I'm a police accountability activist. I've been working on trying to hold police accountable for about 20 years now, mostly locally in Sonoma County. I learned from some people just like me, just some people doing volunteer work in the community, how to do these know your rights trainings. And so I do them every month or two to just kind of give people a basic understanding of what their constitutional rights are when you're dealing with the police. So I'm gonna share my screen with you, and then I'll start talking a little bit about this stuff. And then just, I don't know, people have probably been talking about this today, but today is the 8th anniversary of the death of Andy Lopez, and so that's the person that you see on the screen behind me, who was killed by Eric Gelhaus, Sonoma County Sheriff's deputy. He was shot 7 times through his neighborhood with a plastic BB gun. So I'm going to share my screen here. So these are just some of the organizations I've worked with over the years. ACLU, the Police Accountability Clinic and Helpline, Cop Watch, National Lawyers Guild, the October 22nd Coalition, Food Not Bombs. And these are mostly organizations that started in the community and that have done work to help try to hold police accountable for their actions. So again, I just want to say I'm not a lawyer, so don't rely on my advice as legal advice. This is just information that is mostly factual, law-based, that you can find in multiple locations. Police actually do know your rights training similar to what I do, with a little bit of a different orientation. I am a police accountability activist, so I do have strong opinions about what I think about the police and the system of policing. But the fact is that the more you know about your rights, the safer you are and less likely to be subjected to abuse, harassment, or intimidation by the police during interactions with them. I've shared some resources in the chat window for you with some links. There's a couple of phone apps which that also teach you and give you a list in your pocket of some of these rights that we're going to talk about today, but also that will record interactions with the police and send them to a secure server, and also allow you to live stream your interactions with the police with up to 3 other people. So really useful if you're going to be doing any protesting, or even if you're just, maybe you're by yourself and you get pulled over or stopped walking down the street. Something to have there is just a little added security, and you have a right to record the police during your interactions with them, even though they'll tell you that maybe you don't. Again, some of the groups, the ACLU, the NLG, the National Immigration Law Center, those are some of the links that provide some information that some of it you can print out, some of it's in apps, some of it is stuff that you can read that's specific to immigrant rights, youth rights, LGBTQ rights, and a whole number of things. There's things about your rights during a COVID-19 pandemic, things like that. I'll also give you a link to some complaint processes so that you can file complaints about the police at the Independent Office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach, which is where you go to file complaints against the sheriff's office. And then also Santa Rosa Police Department, there's a link where you can go and find their complaint form, and also phone numbers so that you can make complaints about police there. And again, see the Zoom chat window for the links. So all the stuff that I'm teaching you has its foundation in the United States Constitution and in the California Constitution. And some of those at the very basic level are the First Amendment. You have the right to assemble, which means you have a right to protest, you have a right to be outside, and you have a right to be outside and observing the police in their interactions, because they are public employees. And you also have a right to observe and assemble anybody who is outside and doing, whatever life stuff, right? Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure, so that the cops can't just search you for no reason. Fifth Amendment is a protection against self-incrimination, which allows you to tell the police that you're going to remain silent. You don't want to speak to them without an attorney. The Sixth Amendment gives you the right to a speedy and public trial, and that you have a right to an attorney. And so we'll talk about some of that stuff. That's just so like the police can't just take you and hold you and keep you forever without having you go into a court and to a judge and decide, whether or not they're lawfully detaining you or arresting you. The Eighth Amendment is a protection from excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. So this protects you from physical, mental, emotional abuse by the police, and also from holding you and demanding insane amounts of money before they'll let you out. So I'm gonna also, if you have any questions specifically that come up for you, if you could put them in the chat window as we go along, and then I'll try to come back and answer as many of those things as I can at the end, just so I can keep going, because we're going to cover quite a lot of material here. There's three states of police interaction. The first is what we call consensual, and so this is the kind of interaction you could have with anybody, right? Where everybody who's involved in this interaction is freely giving their consent or their permission to interact, right? So any cop can come up to you and try to engage you in conversation, get you to talk about things, ask you questions, things like that, and that's totally legal. Just like you have the right to go up to a cop or anybody else and ask them questions or try to get them to engage with you. And just like with anybody else, you don't have to talk with the police. You also don't have to show them any form of ID unless you're driving a car, because that's a condition of being able to have a driver's license to drive on roads. But generally, yeah, you don't have to talk with them. So they'll come up and they'll tell you, you have to talk with me, you have to answer my questions and things like that, because that is, they're taught to try to exert their influence on you and get you to talk to them, even though you don't necessarily have to. And so oftentimes, if you're scared or maybe you're not informed about your rights, you'll just go ahead and talk or start answering questions, even though you don't have to. And you might unwittingly, without knowing it, incriminate yourself or incriminate friends or family or people in the community. And so, myself and many attorneys will often tell you that the best course of action when you're interacting with the police at any of these stages of interaction is to not talk with them and say as little as possible and give them only the information that's required. So if during any of these stages of interaction, you can always ask the police, am I free to go? Or am I free to go? Something akin to that. But if you say, am I free to go? They understand that you know about your constitutional rights. So you can say, is it okay if I leave? Or just sort of inform them, I'm going to leave now. Is that okay? Is it okay if I start walking? Something like that, right? But this phrase, am I free to go? Or am I being detained? Lets them know that you understand your constitutional rights. And what happens with that sometimes is, if there isn't really a reason for them to be questioning you or stopping you or engaging with you, they'll just let you go and send you on your way, because now it's more trouble than it's worth. So am I free to go? Am I being detained? And detention and being detained is the second stage of interaction. And in order for the cops to detain you, they have to have a reasonable suspicion to keep you there, right? So that means that any reasonable officer or person of sound mind and body could think that what you're doing is suspicious, that they can reasonably believe that you're involved with the commission of a crime, or that you have specific information about the commission of a crime. So if you're being detained and they suspect you of a crime, you don't have to talk with them, but it's often best if you give them a name and address. There are reasons why you might not want to do that at certain times too. But if you can give them a name and address, like if you're being written a speeding ticket, for example, that you sign what's called a promise to appear. You give them your name and address, and then they can send you something in the mail that says when you have to go to court to talk about that ticket and things like that. And so it may be in your best interest to give them your name and address, right? Because otherwise they can detain you to try to figure out who you are and how they're going to process you through the court system, because they need to know who you are in order to do that. When you're being detained, and if they're trying to question you or things like that, they can pat search you, which means they can pat down the outside of your clothing, and they can also go inside of your pockets if they feel like there's something inside of your pockets while they're patting you down that could hurt them potentially, right? So like they're patting down around your pockets, and it feels like maybe there's a knife in there, maybe there's a gun in there, maybe there's a rock in there, whatever they want to say, that they thought could hurt them. Then they can go inside of your pockets to look for that thing. There's some exceptions to that, like if you're on parole, for example, or sometimes on probation, you have what's called a search clause, which means they can search you, or they're just going to take you to jail, right? So that means you got arrested, you were put on parole, you were put on probation. In order for them to let you out on your parole, you had to sign a thing that said any law enforcement officer can search you anytime that they want to make sure that you're not violating the terms of your parole or your probation. There's something called Terry stops, which is, you might have heard of what's called stop and frisk. There was a big scandal going on in New York City with that, where they were stopping thousands of people. And I know we see this also in Santa Rosa and all over, where they just pull people over, particularly young brown people, and frisk the outside of their pockets, saying that they're trying to make sure that they're safe while they're going to stop you to figure out some information, but there's really no reason for them to be doing that, right? So just going back to the first state of interaction, consensual, there's no legal standard for why they want to engage with you, right? Whereas opposed to detention, they have to have that reasonable suspicion. So then on to the third stage of interaction, which is arrest. And of course, we all understand that that's something that we don't want to be, a stage that we don't want to be at. And there's a much higher standard for when you can be arrested versus when they can just detain you, right? And so that standard is called probable cause, which most people think of as that, they have some evidence that you were involved in the commission of a crime, that they know that you did this crime. The example that we use is for reasonable suspicion. Maybe you were walking down the street, they saw a spray can hanging out of your backpack and with orange cap on it, and then there was some orange wet spray paint on the wall. And so like that's a reasonable suspicion, right? It seems to match up. The probable cause has a little bit more weight to it. Now, maybe they saw the orange can, they see the wet paint on the wall. Now they've stopped you and they see there's orange paint on your fingertips, and then somebody across the street saw you, spray painting a wall, right? And so now that's probable cause. Like it's probably true that you did that, right? That they have evidence that you probably committed that crime. And so you can always ask them questions about what your stages of interaction are. And it's particularly important when you're being arrested to ask them why you're being arrested. And they have to be able to articulate what that probable cause is. So they have to be able to say to you, but we're arresting you because somebody saw you, somebody witnessed you spray painting the wall. We see the wall is painted. We see the orange paint on your fingertips. And so now we're going to arrest you for vandalism, graffiti. I don't know what the legal codes are for those things. And what they tell you about why you're being arrested needs to match what they write down in the arrest report that's going to eventually go to the judge, right? And so it's a really good idea to ask them loudly and clearly, but not aggressively, because you'd never want to be aggressive with the cops. Why this is happening, and if there are other people around, to try to make it so that other people can hear and understand what the situation is. Because if you end up going to court for this arrest and what they told you about why you're being arrested doesn't match what the charges are and what it says in the arrest report, that whole arrest can be thrown out of court by the judge. So let's see. Arrest might be in the form of custody or a citation. So just because they don't take you to jail, that doesn't necessarily mean you haven't been arrested. So, like, for example, I was arrested in Las Vegas for feeding homeless people years and years ago. And they arrested me, they handcuffed me, they wrote up the citation, which just looks like a ticket, and it describes what the arrest charges are. But then they let me go after a couple of hours, right? So I was still arrested, but I didn't have to serve any time for jail for that. I'm going to move on here. So we have a lot to cover. So again, going back to what you can say to them and what might trigger an understanding with the police that might get them to let you go is, am I being detained or am I free to go? Right. And so this is something you want to ask. If a cop comes up to you and starts talking to you during a consensual interaction and you don't want to talk to them, you can say, am I being detained or am I free to go? And they're supposed to tell you, right? They won't necessarily always tell you right away, but they're supposed to tell you, and oftentimes they will. And same thing if you're being detained, right? They have a reasonable suspicion that you did what you did, and they've already asked you some questions now, and it's looking like you haven't been involved in the commission of a crime, but maybe now they're just fishing. They're trying to figure out more information to figure out who did it or whatever. You can continue to ask this question: am I being detained or am I free to go? And again, I want to go back to this idea of like not doing this aggressively, because this is really important in any interaction that you have with the police. Like anytime you become aggressive with the police, that's probably not going to help a situation, right? And oftentimes it'll end up in violent interactions, or maybe being arrested unnecessarily, completely unnecessarily, only because you were aggressive. You can actually be arrested for interfering with an officer or interfering with an arrest, even though you hadn't done anything other than that, right? So practicing saying this, and if you're sitting at home or wherever you're sitting in the classroom, actually say this. Like, make your mouth do these movements, because there's a thing called muscle memory. And it can be really hard to say this stuff to a cop when they're scaring the shit out of you and you're standing in front of them. They have a gun on, they have a dog on a leash behind them, or there's 10 cops in riot gear or whatever, and you don't feel like you want to say anything. But if you've practiced saying it, am I being detained or am I free to go? Then it's going to be easier to say it in that moment. And I've been teaching this stuff for 20 years, and I get in front of cops, I get pulled over or something, and I'm scared, and I forget what I'm supposed to say. So, and if you're a young person who has had very little experience with this kind of thing, like, it can be really frightening, right? So there's this sort of legend that the cops have to ask you or have to give you a Miranda warning, right? So they have to read you your rights before they can arrest you and take you away. And if they didn't tell you your Miranda rights, if they didn't read you your rights, then you're going to get away free. Well, that's not really necessarily the case. And if you've ever watched any cop shows on TV, things like that, you've seen this. You have the right to remain silent when you're questioned. Anything you say or do will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to consult an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. So those are what's called the Miranda warnings. And it used to be that they had to ask you or apprise you of these rights before they arrested you. And now all they have to do is get you to read that at some point before they let you go. And oftentimes it's when you get booked or when they're about to release you, there'll be these rights are written down and they're on a piece of paper, and you're going to sign something that says that you understand what those rights are. So it's also important to remember, I and a lot of people that I work with, we always advise to not answer any questions if you can avoid answering any questions, because you don't have to answer any questions without your attorney present. And you never have to answer anything or give any information or say anything that's going to incriminate you. So the only person that can compel you to say anything is a judge, right? And a cop can't do that. But if you do decide to start answering questions, decide to start having conversation with an officer, it's good to remember that just because you've started talking to them and just because you've started answering questions at some point doesn't mean that you have to keep talking. You can always reassert your right to remain silent. And you can tell them, I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney. So let's see, knowing and understanding your rights is explained to you. Are you willing to answer any questions without an attorney present? Right. And so that's a really important question, because most often that question or that answer should be no. You shouldn't be willing to answer any questions without an attorney present, especially if you've already been arrested. And so again, this is another one of what we call the magic phrases, right? And practicing this is really important. I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney. And again, this is one of those magic phrases because the police understand when you say this exactly like this, that you understand what your rights are. And so oftentimes this will get them to stop questioning you, which they're supposed to do, but they don't necessarily always do. They're trained in police school to investigate and to try to get you to incriminate yourself and give up as much information as possible. And sometimes that can feel really sneaky, so like, for example, if we go back to this was an interaction I had with a Santa Rosa police officer who killed 2 people, and he came up while we were filming the police and started asking me a bunch of questions. And I kept telling him, I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney. Right. And then finally he gave up, but not before he asked me 4 or 5 times, oh, come on, buddy. Don't you just want to talk to me? I'm just a person just like you. How come you don't want to talk to me? You come up and ask us questions. How come we can't ask you questions? Well, because I'm not going to arrest you for whatever you say. officer. That's the difference, right? Yeah, so again, practicing, I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney. So there's three basic types of violations that you deal with when you're, if you're going to get arrested or cited. And so the first one of those things is called an infraction, and that's going to be a fine only. You have a right to a judge. There's no jury. You know, and maybe it's jaywalking for like walking across the street against the traffic light, things like that. Then misdemeanor, which is more serious, can result in a fine and or jail up to a year. You have a right to a judge and a jury for a misdemeanor. And then a felony, it's a fine and or jail longer than a year. So that, you know, this is the kind of thing that puts you in prison or long-term incarceration. And then there's something called a wobbler that's between these two things, where it's a level of seriousness that where the district attorney can decide which way to charge you. Is this going to be a misdemeanor or is this going to be a felony? Then there's three general types of police misconduct. So there's violations of the law, corruption, excessive force, state-sanctioned murder, which is, again, this goes into being my opinion, but often police do kill people and there are no legal consequences for that, right? And so those could be considered violations of the law when anytime a cop kills somebody in the line of duty. You know, the district attorney gets to decide, is that a violation of the law or not? Were they within their rights legally to have taken that person's life? And then there are things like violations of policy. So each police department has a whole set of policies and procedures that kind of their own rules that they've written for themselves about how they're supposed to conduct their business. Those aren't legal, like they don't necessarily have to follow those under the law, but that's a condition of their employment, right? And so trying to follow good ethics and good rules of proceeding are identified in like their policy manuals. You know, like the Santa Rosa Police Department has a 600-page policy manual of all the rules that they're supposed to follow. You know, and it's important to understand that, you know, like if you had a 600-page of rules that your parents gave you, and I apologize, I don't know how old anybody is that's here, because I can't see you on the Zoom. But just for example, if you had 600 pages of rules that your parents wrote down, and you're supposed to be responsible for understanding what every letter of those things say is, that's probably not going to happen, right? So that's the same thing that happens with cops. You know, sometimes there's willful violations of policy or laws, and sometimes maybe they just don't necessarily understand what all the specifics of those policies or laws are. And so, you know, that goes into, you know, you as a private individual having interactions with the police, you can complain to a department about interactions that you've had with the police about violations of policy or violations of the law that you think happened. And, you know, maybe you don't understand what all those things are, but you just feel like whatever they did was wrong, right? And so you can file a complaint, and then it's on that department or potentially on a judge to decide if whatever that officer did was wrong, or a violation of policy or a violation of law. And then, of course, you know, there are unjust laws, right? We know that people are treated differently based on how they look, who they are, what their identities are. You know, just some examples here. There are laws that are actually written that are anti-homeless, right? There are laws that are written in a way that they have to be selectively enforced. So a cop gets to decide who broke that law or not, or whether or not somebody should be arrested for a thing, right? So there's always judgment of an officer on the street or in a situation, where they get to decide that I'm going to try to arrest this person and charge them with this crime, right? And they get to select that. They get to decide when that is. There's things like gang contract databases where people's names and who they associate with and who their families are and where they hang out and what kind of clothes they wear. All these kinds of things are entered into these databases, even though these people maybe have not committed crimes. And then that information is used against those people later on if they are ever arrested for something. And then, of course, there's things like surveillance, racial profiling, youth profiling that go on all the time. So, there's cameras everywhere in society now, right? Everybody has a cell phone in their pocket. There's Ring cameras and Blink cameras, and everybody's watching everything now, and police have access to that information. And so all that stuff sort of affects the way police conduct their business and the way that police misconduct can happen. So understanding your rights about what those things are is really important, and understanding that this is the social framework that we live in, right? This is the kind of stuff that goes on. Just youth rights we'll talk about a little bit. Youth have the same rights protected in the Constitution that any adult has. If you're a kid and you get arrested, clicking around here. Your parent or guardian must be contacted within 1 hour, so that they know that you've been arrested, right? And in schools, the principal or maybe a school resource officer who's a cop that works at the school might want to question you, and you actually have a right to have your parent or guardian present or another adult present to help you understand what's going on before they question you. There's something that happens a lot is if you're going to a public school, in order for you to attend that school, your parents or your guardian have signed off on a piece of paper that says, in order for you to attend that school and to use the school's property, you have to be subject to a search of your school locker or your car if it's parked on the school property. And so they might come and say, we're either going to search these things, or you have to leave the school. We're kicking you out of the school, right? So it's always important to remember another one of these magic phrases is, I do not consent to a search. So this applies at school also. It applies, anytime that you're interacting with the police, they'll come up to you and try to get you to consent to a search, to imply that you've given consent. So if you don't tell them specifically that you don't consent to a search, then you're giving them implied consent to that search. So this one's real important to remember and to practice also. So if a cop comes up to you and reaches out to you, for example, to grab your backpack and says, I'm going to search your bag, they're informing you that they're about to do that. And this is now your opportunity to say, I do not consent to a search, because they can't actually search that backpack, that bag, unless you give them your consent or unless they have a search warrant, right? And so this is one that happens a lot. They inform you that they're going to do this, and people just assume that because they've told you they're going to do it, that means they have a right to do it, and when that's not actually the case. So there's some different types of searches. There's a search of your person and your personal belongings, your backpacks and stuff like I just talked about, searches of your vehicle, searches of your home, searches of your property, or searches of wherever that you happen to live and reside. And there are some different rules and some different things to understand about each of those different types of searches. So I talked about earlier, pat search or an officer safety search. And so the purpose of that is just patting down the outside of your clothes and potentially looking inside your pockets in order to find anything that might potentially be used as a weapon or might potentially be used to do harm, right? Either to the officer or to another person, you or another person that might be around while the search is going on. During those searches, there are things, what's called an incidental find, and that is, so if they patted down the outside of your clothes, they felt a lump in your pocket that they thought was going to be some sort of a weapon or something that could do harm. They pulled out your pocket, and now there's a pipe in there, or you have a blunt in there. Now you can be arrested or charged for that thing, right? And that's a fairly recent change in law. It didn't used to be that way, but that's a good thing to know and understand about what you keep in your pockets. And again, even during this pat search or officer safety search, it's always a good idea to say loudly and clearly and unaggressively, "I do not consent to a search," and hopefully loudly and clearly enough that somebody else who's present can hear that. In order to search your person beyond just that officer safety search, they are supposed to now identify a reasonable suspicion for why they want to search you. And so they have to reasonably suspect that you've been involved in the commission of a crime in order to do that. Vehicles, sorry, I just want to check the time here. Okay, we're doing all right. With your vehicle, there's something that's called a plain view protocol. So if you get pulled over and they can see inside of your car, they can see some drug paraphernalia, they can see something that might be used as a weapon or anything else that they deem to be illegal, that is fair game, right? So it's real important to, if you are going to have something in your possession that you think is illegal, don't keep it in plain view. That's not me trying to condone that you have an illegal stuff, but it's something to understand. Any sort of a search has a component of officer discretion. So the officer gets to decide when they want to search or not. So what they can see inside of your car is real important. Anytime that they ask to search your car or you or your house or anything else, this means that they are actually asking for your permission because they need your permission to do it. And so that's another opportunity for you to say, "I do not consent to a search." Another time that they can search your car without a search warrant is if the arrest is near, so they've already decided that they're going to arrest you for something, and that your car may have evidence inside of it that is evidence of the commission of that crime. So now they can search your car for that without a warrant. Anytime they come to search your home, assuming you have a front door, good idea to keep the front door locked. Don't just let them in. You can step outside and lock the door. Remember to take your keys. They can come inside your house if there's an imminent threat to safety. So this happens oftentimes in cases of domestic violence. If somebody's abusing somebody else in the home and they suspect that that's happening, they can come inside in order to stop that imminent threat to safety of somebody. There's something during any interaction with the police to keep in mind that they may ask you to step back while they're searching or while they're interacting with somebody. And that doesn't mean you have to go to the other end of the earth. What that means is they're trying to keep you from being a threat to them. And so that the courts have found that you have to get back far enough so that you can't like lunge or jump at them and be a threat to them. So you want to stay lunging distance away. When there's parolees in the house, this is another another condition where they can just come into the house anytime and search the area of the home where the parolee lives or where the parolee might normally associate. So the common living spaces, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, any other unlocked areas of the home. So in order for them to do any sort of non-consensual search, or that isn't a search that's about an imminent threat to safety, they need to have a search warrant. And that search warrant needs to have specific information that has been looked at and decided by. So that includes a person's name, the area of the search, the duration of the search warrant, and what it is they're looking for during the course of that search. And so you can ask to see that search warrant. If they come to your house or your property or your car and they want to search those places or those things, you can say, I want to see the search warrant, and they're supposed to present you with that warrant. And you can look to make sure that there's a person's name, an area of search, the time of when that search is supposed to take place, what they're looking for, and also important, a judge's signature. Because if search warrant doesn't have all of those things, then that search warrant may not be valid. Something to remember about property is that there are areas that you may think are your private property, but aren't necessarily. So like your front yard, if there's not a fence that's locked with or a sign that says that there's no trespassing, then that's what's called a quasi-public area. And so the police can come into that area. And in fact, anybody can come into that area until you specifically tell them that they have to leave. So the police might roll up on your property and show up on your front door, and you think that they are there when they shouldn't be. That's not necessarily the case. So just good to understand. If it's not posted, again, as trespassing, no trespassing, then it's not trespassing. Once you ask somebody to leave, then they're supposed to. The owner of a property that you live at, like if you have a rental property, for example, right, may have legal control of the overall property. But if you are renting a space, then you actually have legal control of that property. So like your landlord can't just tell the cops they can go into your apartment without a warrant, right? Because you're actually, somebody is actually legally in control of that property as the leaseor or the renter. And so again, just good to remember, no fence, no lock, no privacy, right? So if they're coming to your house and they want to question you, one area where this happens a lot is like if people are having parties and they have the front door wide open and people are coming and going freely, or they have the back gate open, party going on in the backyard, things like that. If people are coming and going freely and there's no trespassing sign posted, the cops can just walk right in and say, hey, we're here, like what's going on, right? And so then that goes back to, whatever they can now see that's clearly illegal that's going on and they had a legal right to be there, that changes the situation. And I'm just going to go through some of this stuff real quick. This is sort of related. This is sort of my orientation with some of this right stuff is, I was learning how to watch the police in the performance of their duties. And you do have a right to watch the police under the First Amendment in the performance of their duties. You have a right to videotape. Nobody out in public that's coming and going out in the public has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So, you can film the cops, but also the cops can film you, right? So that's important to remember. There are some laws about what that means. You're not, according to the California Penal Code, you're not supposed to interfere, obstruct, or delay an officer on their duty. So you can watch them, but don't get in their way Don't interfere with what they're doing. Police are supposed to, the uniformed police are supposed to be identified by a name or number that identifies them specifically. So that, like, if you want to file a complaint with their department or with ILARO, for example, then you can ask them for their name or badge number. They won't necessarily always give that to you, but it's your right to have it in the state of California, and you can ask. Most law enforcement agencies have specific policies. Every law enforcement agency in Sonoma County has a policy about it. Hello? Sorry. Rafa, are you saying something?
No, somebody's mic was on, but it's okay.
Oh, okay. I thought, how much time do I have left?
You have about 3-4 minutes left.
Okay. All right. We're gonna wrap this up. So since we only have a very limited time left, I just want to reiterate, anytime that you're asserting your rights with the police and informing the police that you understand what your rights are, as a person that's on the soil here, you don't have to have any particular immigration status or any particular set of papers or anything else to enjoy these rights. Like, we all have these rights. But when you are about to inform them of these things or use some of these magic phrases that we talked about, keep calm, use polite language, slow movements, keep your hands where they can see them, don't reach into your pockets, keep visible, no sudden weirdness, things like that. That's always going to be the best way to keep yourself safe. You know, it can be real hard sometimes. And, you know, not to be biased, but like, I know as a man with a lot of testosterone, and there's a lot of men with testosterone that are police, we can get real like adversarial with each other real fast based on just that. So it's a good idea to just remember, like, the police in Sonoma County, there's been about 100 officer involved fatalities in Sonoma County in the last 20 years. And there's been, how many of them has been put in jail? None yet. That's the framework, right? There's been a lot of people, regular people, that have gone to jail for interacting with the police negatively and aggressively, but it doesn't work the other way. Let's see here. Check out some of the links that I put in the chat. There's some real good stuff there. The apps for iPhone and for Android that touch on all of the stuff that I talked about today. There's pages in the app that you can look at on your phone that tells you all your rights. Those magic phrases that I talked about. I do not consent to a search. I want to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney. Am I free to go or am I being detained? Those things are all in there. Tools for recording the police and sending it to the cloud or sending it to your friends and things like that. I highly recommend having those tools. They're free and easy to use. And also the ILARO, the Independent Office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach, was established in the county after the Andy Lopez tragedy and killing by Sonoma County Sheriff's Deputy Gelhaus. And that is a resource for complaining about the sheriff's office. I highly recommend that people use that resource. You can just Google ILARO and that'll come up. If you have a specific complaint about any police department, you can Google the name of that police department and complaint form, and it will take you to a complaint form. Some of them have it online, some of them you have to print it out and fill it out and then turn it into them. But that's a real easy way. You can do it right from your phone. You don't have to have a link or anything. So I highly encourage people to use those complaint processes. If you think you've been discriminated against, if you think you've been abused, or treated improperly in any way by the police, that's what those processes are set up for. And I think that's it.